the Happy Scientist Podcast. Each episode is designed to make you more focused, more productive, and more satisfied in the lab. You can find us online at bitesizebio.com/happy scientist. Your hosts are Kenneth Vogt, founder of the executive coaching firm Vera Claritas, and Dr. Nick Oswald, PhD, bioscientist, and founder of Bite Size Bio.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Happy Scientist Podcast. This is the place to be if you want to be a happier, healthier, and more productive scientist. I'm Nick Oswald, the founder of bitesizebio.com, and today we will be drawing on the wisdom of Mr. Kenneth Vogt, Bite Size Bio's Mr. Miyagi, and founder of the executive mentoring company Vera Claritas. Today and in all of the other Happy Scientist podcast episodes, you get to benefit from Ken's wisdom and chi to help you increase your performance, enjoyment, and success in the lab. Today's episode is an interesting one. So we scientists tend to get stuck in the idea that science can explain everything, when in reality it's just one way to look at the world. So today we'll be opening that up and exploring what science can learn from other disciplines. Okay, Ken, take it away.
All right. Well, I'm stirred by that introduction.
The chi.
In fact, I was thinking, with something you just said, that science tends to look to science for its answers, but I don't even know if that's true. I think scientists tend to look to their own branch of science for answers. The point is that if you could change your outlook on this and start looking to cast a wider net for where can you draw other ideas from, you're going to realize there is a rich world out there. There's a lot of opportunity for things that will improve your science. Now, in some cases, it may actually improve the science itself, but in other cases, it's going to improve the structure and the infrastructure that is supporting your science. And you can't ignore that either. That's also important. And if you become aware of other things that have already been done and are already working, that have a proven track record, that's about as scientific approach as there is. These are hypotheses that have been formulated and tested and proven. Well, why not implement them in the scientific realm as well, and get the benefit from that? And I want to start off in what I think is probably the easiest place to look, because it's a place you're already familiar with, because you had to spend a lot of time there before you got to the lab, and that's academia. And in fact, academia has had a lot of influence on science. It has a lot of influence on the structure of science. And in fact, many scientists are still working in academic institutions. That's where the labs are. So that being the case, and I gave Nick about 30 seconds warning that I was going to really drag him into this one. Nick spent more time in academia than I have, so I want to open up this idea of what is going on in academia that could be instructive for science. So anything come to mind for you, Nick?
There's a question. Okay. Well, I didn't spend that much time in academia. So I did an undergrad, and then I did a PhD, and then I was out of academia.
You realize everybody doesn't have a PhD.
Well, okay. Compared to some people listening to this, I've spent a lot more time in academia, true. So they will know a lot more about academia than I do. My what episode do you discuss the spiral dynamics stuff? It must somewhere in episode 1 to 9.
That's in episodes 4, 5, and 6.
Episodes 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so have a look back at that. But academia is very much blue. Or you probably know that anyway. It's very structured. It's very much about creating, for me anyway, looking at it from the kind of outside in, it's about creating structures or silos of knowledge around personalities in a way. The personalities being principal investigators, the star scientists, and then, the next layer up being institutions. So, what you can learn from that versus, or I don't know about what you can learn from it, but it's a different mindset, isn't it? All these are, in a way, they're just different mindsets. Whereas in business, in industry, you could never get away with, or it'd be much more difficult to justify chipping away at something just for the sake of creating knowledge. That wasn't generating an application, for example, or didn't look like it was going to generate an application that you could make profit out of. In academia, it's the other way around. You literally pour hours and brain power and equipment and manpower and all that stuff, person power, into creating silos of knowledge to see how they connect up, and then what can come from them application wise, and then that normally goes out into industry. So I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's the way I see the mindset being, and the distinction being, it's about academia is about generating knowledge for the sake of generating knowledge.
And as you've mentioned, they are blue. And by the way, if you don't know what we're talking about when we say they're blue, listen to episodes 4 through 6, please. It will all become clear.
Basically, it just means it's very structured, and it's about blobs.
Yeah, but that structure is beneficial. That structure has its upside, and so sometimes you can realize, if you look back at how things are organized there, that it could give you clues as to how you might want to organize your lab, or how you might want to organize your procedures. So so there's advantages to having that kind of structure that's reliable and regulated and replicatable. So
well, I mean, another way to look at it is, if you are in industry, I know that you're tending to go for the project, especially if you're a smaller company, or you're tending to go for the things that will make money, because that's the survival. But I know of companies who allowed things to happen on the side, and examples of this from outside of not in science, other areas of business, where you allowed people to just tinker for the sake of tinkering, and then really good stuff came out of it. So that's maybe
Google's famous for that.
Exactly. So that's maybe one lesson from academia to bear in mind, regardless of which area of science you're in, is that it doesn't all have to be driving towards the goal. Allowing a bit of play at the side can often help, especially if you want to be a groundbreaker. You don't just want to churn out the money, sort of thing. Yeah.
Now that being said, there's a lot to be learned from business also.
Yes.
That is applicable. In business, in many cases, it's more orange rather than blue. And when we say orange, we mean that they're about ambition, they're about achievement, they're about getting something done. Which is a little different than, say, discovery. And discovery is about finding things, but achievement means I don't care whether you find anything or not. I just got to make sure that something is accomplished by the end of the day. And that mindset isn't necessarily bad. In fact, it can drive discovery, and on top of that, it can just drive practical solutions, because a lot of the stuff that Bite Size Bio is talking about is, we call it basic science. It's the fundamentals. The applications come often well beyond fundamentals, though, and that is where money comes in. And money does matter, according to Randy Newman. It's money that matters. But sometimes you might look at this and go, I don't want to corrupt my lab with that kind of thinking. It's like, well, it isn't necessarily corrupt. I mean, yet I will grant you it could be corrupting, but doesn't have to be, because there are plenty of businesses out there that are just as altruistic as plenty of labs out there. In fact, there's plenty of labs out there that are less altruistic than some businesses. So, money doesn't automatically corrupt things. The misstatement that money is the root of all evil, that's not what it said. It said the love of money is the root of all evil. So it's different.
It's interesting because it is, the more I look at this, the more this is just, it's about, it's easy to judge the mindsets of other areas when you're not in them, other disciplines when you're not in them. But this is just about, it's almost about different viewpoints on the same problem, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
You even just that thing about talking about a business being altruistic or a business not being altruistic. A lot of that will depend on whether they're in survival mode or not, which is can be a function of where they are in their growth, in their development. A startup is very unlikely to be altruistic because they're trying to put all of the power into growing the business, all the money, the power that they have into growing the business. Whereas a business that's huge then has more scope to be altruistic. But you can't. It's easy to judge businesses that are not altruistic, and when you are, like, put the cat amongst the pigeons. If you're sitting in an academic lab which has a bunch of funding that secures it for the next 5 years, and you can, trying to make a model comparison is not really valid because it's two completely different situations.
Exactly. And some businesses, they're, their basic tenet isn't a moral argument. Well, like, for instance, let's mention the petroleum industry. A lot of people just hate the petroleum industry. But the fact is that petroleum was an absolutely critical component for the Industrial Revolution and everything that exists today. If it hadn't been for petroleum, we wouldn't have the science we have today. So it's not necessarily all evil. I mean, can it be used wrong? Of course. Can it be tone deaf about certain things? Yes, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. And by the way, that's instructive too. When we see failings in other disciplines, there's lessons there you don't have to learn in your discipline. You can take that lesson and go, wow, let's not go down that road.
Yeah.
So
I'm looking at this list that you have here, and it's looking a bit daunting. We've started with two easy ones already.
Oh, I still want to break down business a bit, because kind of a subset of business is finance. Now, finance is something you're certainly familiar with in the scientific world, because, man, getting money to do what you do is a huge part of the job, unfortunately. I say unfortunately, but but it is what it is, and but how do businesses finance themselves, and how do they treat finance, and how do they manage finance? That stuff is just as applicable to your operation. You run you may run, or you may be part of, an organization that has a financial structure to it that is just as critical as any other business, or any other nonprofit, or any school. So it still has to be taken into consideration, and you can't say, well, we're above that. We don't mess with that. No, you can't ignore it. It has to be part of what you do. And having a scientific mind, you may well find you can do it as well or better than someone else. One of the things that I do is, when I do executive coaching for companies, and I've worked with a variety of different kinds of companies. And often what's the case is the person who comes to me for assistance is very good at what they do. I mean, really good, outstandingly good at it. But they never run a business before. It's a new skill set for them. Now, it doesn't mean it's a skill set beyond their capability. It's not rocket science to run a business. But then again, it's not kindergarten either, So it's worth getting good at parts of business that are touching you. Now, this may not be true for everyone who's listening right now. Maybe you're in a new position in a lab. You don't touch the financial part of this at all. It's not part of your world. Okay, that's fine. But for many of you, it does touch you. And for many of you, if it isn't touching you now, it's going to touch you. So it's not a bad idea to have some familiarity with these things. And it's not hard to get knowledge of these on these topics. Thank goodness for the internet, and there's so much free information that can get you up to speed pretty quickly. So enough of the mundane stuff you're familiar with. How about psychology? How would psychology be beneficial in science? And I think a lot of scientists would look at that and say, not only is it not beneficial, it is detrimental to get your head stuck in these willy-nilly notions. And, it's some people will even argue that psychology is barely a science itself, that it's too soft. But the fact is, it's had a big influence on, modern society, and certainly, well, I would say at least Western society, but possibly not just Western society. There's a lot of call them important psychologists that come from the other side. and to my mind, there's two types of psychology that one could know about. One that is professional psychology and popular psychology. And professional psychology is going to be the people that are actually educated and degreed, and we're talking about deep thinkers that are well known even to the public. We've all heard of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. They've been influential in that regard, and what they've had to say was extremely influential, and a lot of people have built on their work, and a lot of the work that they did will impact how you work. I mean, it talks about how you work. It talks about why you're driven to do the work you do. It talks about why you have certain blind spots. And many of the episodes that we've done in the past are reminiscent of some of those concepts and many of you have commented about how it's been helpful to you and useful to you. So don't blow it off automatically. It's there. And if you took some psychology classes in the course of getting your education, and that struck a chord with you, take a look at that again through the lens of, how will this help me in the lab? What will this tell me about what my motivations are and what other people's motivations around me are? Now, if we flip over to the pop psychology side, and I think that term pop psychology as opposed to popular psychology, it's meant to be degrading. It's like, yeah, this is phony psychology is the argument. But the fact is there's a lot of sound foundational tools in popular psychology that are useful. And again, we've talked about some of those things in past episodes. And there are whole books written on just single concepts. And meant to be accessible, meant to be applicable in your life and in your world. Well, the argument I'm making now is, well, look, let's make sure you apply them in the lab. It's like, we've done episodes on habits, for instance. That's one thing that comes to mind here. We probably talked about time management, or these are part of that popular psychological discussion out there that apply, that actually matter.
And there's a core psychology. Again, I probably talk about this every second episode, but there's a core psychology at the heart of science, which is non-attachment to the result. And you get that bit of psychology wrong in yourself or in your lab, where you're chasing results, and suddenly it's not science anymore. So there's how fundamental psychology is to science.
Well, there you go. All right, so the next area that I was thinking about was society. Society has a lot of impact on what you could do in science, and I break the idea of society down into a couple different things. But the broad point of this is that what is going on around us in our culture impacts our science, and we've seen cultural impacts on science be horrifying in the past. And there's been human experimentation and people being science guinea pigs without even their knowledge, and so some terrible things have happened based on lessons from society. But there are other things about society that are very, very positive, things that have been truly beneficial, and we don't want to miss those lessons we want to bring them into science. Like just looking at society from the standpoint of history, what can we learn from history that will teach us about how to approach science? Science used to be, say, basically part of the church. You're like, wow, science and church, aren't those things practically natural enemies? And like, well, no, not really. And um, there was a reason why that was there. Back in the day, the only people who were educated were the priests. And I mean, you can go back way back, and that was literally the only education in society was the priesthood. So, and by the way, I'm not arguing for that being the way it should be now. But I am pointing out that there has been a connection there. And don't lose the benefit of connections of what historically science has meant in the past. It used to be that being a scientist wasn't a separate thing. You were always also a scientist. You were never exclusively a scientist. But we've gotten pretty darn compartmentalized these days, and so there's not as much sharing with other areas of knowledge, for instance, other parts of society. So the opportunity is there. Now, another one I thought was interesting when we think about society is politics. And of course, there's been a lot of controversy around politics affecting scientific decisions lately. But there's a lot of positive things about politics too. Politics have driven how certain science is developed. Think about this. Think about landing on the moon, for instance. It's also driven what's important, like finding a vaccine for polio. It became an all-in feature, and politics mattered because politics added it added focus, it added conversation, in the population, it added possibilities of funding. There was all kinds of parts to this. So we want to look at, well, how can we at least make this be beneficial? And two, you can look at this from how do we stop this from causing harm? Because the fact is that all the controversy about COVID science being politicized pointed out some weaknesses in science too. So it's worth looking at and saying, okay, what do we learn from this? How can we make this better? And how do we fill the holes that were uncovered because it got too political? So yeah, and I'm not taking a side on this because I don't even know what the sides are anymore. But I can say that it's pretty obvious that there's been an impact, and it hurt the reputation of science to a certain degree, and among the general population started to have some doubts about science. Well, that's something that needs to be shored up.
Yeah, I think that the one good thing here is that, or one, like, how can I put this? One kind of lesson here from the recent struggles with this is that science has driven, a lot, especially in biology, but all other areas of science as well. Really, you're fundamentally for gaining knowledge, but also the direction of that effort is generally mostly aimed at being altruistic. It's mostly aimed at solving problems for society to make quality of life better for everyone. And there was a very acute need for that during COVID, for to solve a problem. And so there's a play between society and politics being ultimately the expression of what the people want, really. So people wanted a cure for COVID, or something to at least blunt the effect of COVID, to help us cope with COVID. And so that gets taken into politics, and then politics is a distortion for it always gets distorted because it's about controlling narratives and stuff like that. However, the push did come from the people, and science did respond. So it's almost like the lesson is that again, it's about being a bit more detached, I think, about it's fine for politics to influence science, but the science has got to lead. The science is a
Right.
very gentle, fragile instrument that you can cast out and find a direction. But as soon as you squash it with your own ambition or with or your own bias or a political bias or even a very strong public need, then the science becomes, it gets overrun, it gets crushed. And I think science did relatively well to stand up to that during COVID. We still managed to get out something that was, coherent and did help in the end. But there are certainly lessons about, for me, it's a lot of it comes back to this stepping back and allowing science to be science, regardless of the motivations that are pushing it.
Exactly. So, all right. Well, let me flip to another notion in society you might not think of that could have lessons for the lab, and that's fiction and art. And let's add music to that. Like, how would that be useful? Well, let me give you a simple example. There was a book written by somebody named Andy Weir called The Martian, and it was written just on a blog, piece by piece, and people got really excited about it. And a lot of scientists got really excited about it because he was going out of his way to try to be as scientific as possible in what he wrote. Well, then it turned into a movie with Matt Damon as the star, and and it was a fascinating book. And that's, of course, is creating or has been part of the creation of this drive to go to Mars. That's a huge deal, and so many different areas of science are impacted by that. Now, it's on top of that, I happen to be reading another book by Andy Weir. It's called Hail Mary. That was, well, I won't go into the whole story, but there's a lot of biology in it. It's a science fiction book, and the Martian was renowned for being pretty scientifically accurate, and he went and he got a lot of help with that because the author himself is not a scientist. But the main character in Hail Mary is a biologist that was sent to outer space. So it's pretty amazing. But the point being is that it's getting this into people's heads, and people are reading this and getting interested in the science, and kids are reading this and getting interested in being scientists, and it's pointing to problems that may need to be solved. Maybe we don't have them today, but we're going to have them. So, fiction and art and music talk about problems or potential problems, and sometimes they're just fantasies, but they're fantasies that are credible fantasies. They could happen. And part of what science can do is to hit off problems. And so it's beautiful that there are people out there positing these potential problems, because it's just creating something in the zeitgeist, something else for us to think about. And then the last area.
Well, what you take from that is imagination, yeah. It's the power of imagination in your own work as well.
Right.
You cast out stuff, you cast out ideas, wild ideas, and then suddenly it opens up your mind to the possibilities.
Right. And well, truth is stranger than fiction too. As I bet you many of you scientists can point out to that. You've had that experience where you've came across something and go, wow, that's just nuts. Nobody would believe this if I didn't have all this data to prove it.
Yeah, I mean, again, and it also goes back to the idea of allowing yourself to daydream, like to just daydream about, what are the possible directions here, what are the possible solutions. But I mean, as a scientist, that lateral thinking and things like that can really help you, and that's just that's basically a facet of imagination. So yeah, I like that. What can you learn from art? Imagine more. Give yourself time to imagine. Don't just get your head out of the the lab book and let your imagination run.
Yeah, And if so fiction and other fictional things can be a starter point for that. Um, but those are all made up. But what about folk wisdom? There are plenty of things out there that people have been operating on for a while, and there's something to it. And in many cases, it hasn't been scientifically investigated. Um, and of course, a lot of drugs have come out of that kind of investigation. We have heart medications thanks to digitalis. Because somebody figured out a long time ago that plant had an impact on you. And there are many plants that have impacts, and so much of our medicine chest has been drawn from the rainforest, because and people have already figured this stuff out. The ancient societies, and sometimes it's not just about medicine. It's about methods and approaches to life that have become colloquial sayings and things. Well, it's worth looking at that and saying, well, how do I apply this? Or is there an application here for this? And I've noticed that often in my consulting practice, I've found that popular sayings or folk wisdom come in all the time, because you see here's a situation where it matters, where it applies, and that memory of that thing, it makes it an easy handle for somebody to grasp. Like, oh, I've heard that before. A stitch in time saves nine. Why does that matter? Oh yeah. If I plan ahead, I do better. If I watch for mistakes in advance, I can hit them off. So there's plenty of opportunity there to make an application to how you operate your lab, how you operate your experiments, how you plan, how you structure things, how you implement safety protocols. There's just, it goes deep, and a lot of the stuff's already built into you. We've all got that because it just comes up from growing up in society and being in families. We have things we brought forward, but let's use that. There's that thing that grandma said. Maybe your grandma said it and mine didn't. So if you don't bring it to the lab, how's it going to get there? So we have a certain obligation to take our life experience and bring it forward into the lab. So the last area I was thinking about is philosophy. And I know for a lot of folks that's going to be like, wow, that is like anti-science. That is the unprovable stuff. That is the stuff where the scientific method there's nowhere to use it. However, there are parts of philosophy that are extremely important in science. And the first one that came to mind was ethics. There are now scientific ethicists, where it's a full discipline, because there are things you can do in science. Now the argument is, should you do them? And there have been times when things that were done that probably shouldn't have been done. Or there are times when things should have been done, and there was a lack of will. There was a lack of drive to do it because there was no scientific pressure to do it. But if there was ethical pressure to do something, then it would move forward. So you don't want to leave ethics out. And I think, for the most part, you probably don't want to leave them out. There are cases, obviously, where ethics could get in the way. And like I think about, there was a situation where somebody had got a hold of CRISPR and thought, we can edit out the genes for this couple that could lead to their child having asthma. And that experiment actually got done. And, there was actually a genetically modified baby as a result. And you look at that and go, well, that's about as innocuous as it could be. But it does open up questions. And there are questions that ought to be asked, because is there a line? Well, first off, we need to know, is there a line? And second of all, then we need to know, well, if there is a line, where is that line? So, ethics do matter in science. And you might think, well, I just do basic research. I don't think that's going to touch me, but um, it's surprising how often it does matter, how often it will show up. And the issue is, how far in advance will we think about it? We think, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with this particular science, but if its only application is for something that we don't want to touch, well, that's something to think about. And then the final area I want to mention, I kind of mentioned this before, but religion. You think, well, religion and science, they don't have anything to do with each other, or even they're even at odds in some cases. Some people have made it at odds. But the fact is that religion and science have a long storied history together, and they have driven each other.
Well, they're both about the same thing.
Exactly.
What the hell is this all about? And how does it work?
And two, one answers questions that the other can't answer. People look at holy books. Well, they're not science books. They're not meant to be science books, and they're full of stories and allegories. And some people have sometimes taken issue with that. Well, this allegory isn't scientifically accurate. Well, it's an allegory. Cut it some slack.
You look at what those things are, and it's people's attempt, and whether you think they are valid attempts or not, people's attempts through the ages to capture something about what the hell this is.
Right. And they have the limitations of the times too.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when you didn't have a telescope and you'd never been to outer space, there's certain things you can't see. But the other side of it is religion is about wonder and awe, and that wonder and awe that is how science came to be. People were looking for a way to answer that, and science was born.
It's funny because a lot of scientists that I know use what we know about science to squash the wonder and awe. And whether you believe in a higher being or however you want to talk about it, the fact is that this is weird. This whole thing is like, why, how did this happen?
Sure.
and why is it here? And even if you go with the extreme kind of 1,000 monkeys with a typewriter would eventually create whatever the works of Shakespeare or whatever it is. Even if you go with that, it's still pretty remarkable that how the series of chance events that led to that. So you can still be in awe at that.
Yeah, and by the way, all you scientists out there, there's a good experiment. Go get your 1,000 monkeys. Let's see if you can do that.
Oh, you need 1 billion years or a few billion years or whatever. But I don't know how he frames it, but Dawkins does it like that, doesn't he? But I think that the lesson you can take from it is to just have it's a bit like the opening up and have an imagination. It's like, be amazed. You're watching cell division happening in a microscope. Be amazed at what that is amazing. That is mind-blowing. And if you minimize how mind-blowing that is, you're missing out.
Exactly. So all this being said, look at all these areas that could be instructive to how science can be done. And I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list. You may have other things. I'm just a few other things came to mind, like sports or television, the internet. What other things are out there that have figured where they figured some things out, and we could take those lessons and apply that in the lab and apply that in scientific research and in the scientific community. There's lots and lots of opportunities. So don't cut yourself off. Don't get all proud that, well, my area of life is the one that is most important and most matters and is most effective and efficient. Because, probably there are other areas of life that have a few bright spots. So bring them in.
That is a very useful perspective on perspectives. Okay, thank you, Ken. So just to Are you going to include the book?
I'll include a couple books. I'll include The Martian and Hail Mary. They're
The
fun.
Martian is an incredible book.
Yeah.
I haven't read Hail Mary, so I'm going to do that. So that's why I was asking if we would put it in so that I can get it.
Yeah.
Right. So, so you will find references to those or links out to those books that Ken mentioned on our website, bitesizebio.com/The Happy Scientist. This being episode 52. Yes, 52. So those will be in the show notes. In that same place you can find all of the previous episodes, including 1 to 9, episodes 1 to 9, the famous foundational principles from Mr. Miyagi himself. And
especially 4 to 6, we talked about those today.
Yeah, and 4 to 6 we talked about today when we talked about the blue orange things, which is that's an incredible. It's just a lens on the world, but it's a really useful one. Anyway, so I would recommend you go back and take a look at those or have a listen to those if you haven't already. And you can also join us at facebook.com/The Happy Scientist Club, all one word, and ask us questions, say hello, and get additional content in there. We'd love to see you in there. So thank you, Ken, for another great episode. And thank you to you for listening in. And we hope to see you on the next episode of The Happy Scientist. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
The Happy Scientist is brought to you by Bitesize Bio, your mentor in the lab. Bitesize Bio features thousands of articles and webinars contributed by hundreds of PhD scientists and scientific companies who freely offer their hard-won wisdom and solutions to the Bitesize Bio community.